Welcome back to Winning Through Culture. So continuing in our greatest hits, this is one that is definitely going to go in the record books for me. This episode features Jordan Raynor, and we had him as a keynote speaker in our organization back in 2022. And the podcast that this episode is really crafted around really focuses on being purposeful, present, and wildly productive. I mean, what more could you want out of life? But even more so, in this episode, Jordan talks about 7 time management principles that really help you as a leader be impactful and relevant, maintaining healthy boundaries, and really being thoughtful when you prioritize your yes.
Well, welcome to another episode of Winning Through Culture. I am really excited today. We are here with Jordan Raynor. Jordan helps Christians respond to the radical biblical truth that their work matters for eternity. He does this through his best-selling books, The Creator in You, his most recent book, Redeeming Your Time, which we will discuss today, Master of One and Called to Create. He has a podcast called Mere Christians and a weekly devotional, The Word Before Work. All of this is content that has served millions of Christ followers in every country on earth. In addition to his writing, Jordan serves as the executive chairman of Threshold 360. That is a venture-backed tech startup, which Jordan previously ran as CEO following a string of successful ventures of his own. Jordan has twice been selected as a Google Fellow and served in the White House under President George W. Bush. He's a 6th-generation Floridian, lives in Tampa with his wife and 3 young daughters, and Raynors are proud members of the church at Odessa. Jordan Raynor, welcome to Winning Through Culture.
It's a joy to be with you, Tim. Thanks for having me.
It's great to have you. I know we planned this a while back, and here we are. So let's dive in. I mean, you are someone that I have admired from afar and got to know, I guess it was last year, earlier this year, all blends together. But you have quite an impressive resume, and we're going to talk a little bit about your book, Redeeming Your Time. But I mean, you're a Christian, you're a father, you're an entrepreneur, you're an author, podcaster. How do you manage to do all that, Jordan?
Oh, man. Tim, I get this question a lot. I mean, the honest answer is redeeming your time is kind of the answer. This book is kind of the answer. But I tell people all the time, I do it with a lot of grace with myself, not gracefully, right? But giving myself a lot of grace and hopefully extending that same grace to other people in my life. No, but seriously, and it's part of the reason why I wanted to write Redeeming Your Time. I try my hardest to quote unquote do it all, to manage my time the way that the most productive human being who ever walked the earth managed his time. And Christian or not, I think it's pretty hard to dispute that Jesus of Nazareth is the most productive human being to ever live. Time magazine has called him the person of the last 2 millennia. No big deal, right? And I believe when you look at Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, these first 4 books of the New Testament of the Bible, we call them the Gospels. These are biographies of the life of Jesus. We don't typically read religious text as biographies. We read them for theology, for ethics and ways of living. But Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are biographies of the life of Christ, this most productive person who ever walked the earth. And I think when you read them in that way, you can see at least 7 timeless time management principles that enabled Jesus to be wildly productive, as I say in this book. And that's how I'm trying to live my life today. That's how I'm trying to, quote unquote, do it all, Tim.
Well, I read the book not once, but twice, and very impactful as a achiever myself, someone that tries to do it all. I also know that there's a lot of wisdom in those Gospels you refer to relative to the most productive person to walk the earth. Let's dive into the book a little bit, Jordan, if we could. I mean, the purpose of the book is to help people be the best, most Christ-like versions of themselves possible, being purposeful, impactful, meaningful, wildly productive, to your point. Can you share with us, as you reference, the 7 time management principles that you cover in the book?
Yeah, I'd be more than happy to give a flyover version of those. So, and again, these are what I think we could see in the life of Christ in the biographies. Number 1, Jesus started with the Word. the word of God. In other words, he started with a manual for something that was bigger than himself and the work he had in front of him for that particular day, right? So I think we got to do the same thing. If we want to redeem our time, as the title of the book suggests, for something beyond the temporal, for something that's going to outlive us, we have to start with a manual that outlives us, that existed before we did, and that will continue to exist long before we're gone. So for me, that's the word of God. That's the Holy Scriptures, the Bible, right? So that's principle number one, start with the word. Principle number two, let your yes be yes. This is a command directly from Jesus' mouth. He told his disciples, let your yes be yes or your no be no. Anything more than this is from the evil one, right? Strong words. Translate that to modern parlance. To say you're going to send somebody a proposal by the end of the week and fail to do it is from the evil one, right? To say on my voicemail greeting, I'm going to call you back as soon as I possibly can, and that is from the evil one. Maybe that's a little extreme, but I don't know, right? But so much in my experience, so much of time management literature is focused on new things. It's setting goals to do new stuff. And Jesus encourages us to start with the stuff we've already committed to. So that's the second principle of the book, let your yes be yes. Principle number three, I call descent from the kingdom of noise. When you read the gospel biographies, Jesus of Nazareth spent a staggering amount of time in quiet places, lonely places, solitary places, right? He needed silence to think, I believe, to be creative, and most importantly, to listen to the voice of God. And I think we do as well today, now more than ever. We're living at the noisiest time in history, to cite the cliche of all cliches. Principle number four, prioritize your yeses. Jesus didn't say yes to everything. Neither can we. I think we know this, but what does that look like practically? I really dive deep there in that chapter of the book. Principle number five, accept your unipresence. So this is a weird word, obviously a made up word. Christians believe that God is omnipresent, meaning he's everywhere all the time. But what's interesting about Jesus, while Christians believe that Jesus was 100% God, he was also 100% man. And for 33 years, he traded that godly omnipresence, the ability to be everywhere all the time, for the human unipresence that you and I experience today. The problem is, a lot of us live as if we can at least mentally be in a bunch of different places at the same time. Jesus shows us that's impossible for the God of the universe. That's exactly right, right? Principle number six is embrace productive rest. That sounds like an oxymoron for high achievers like us, but Jesus shows us it's one of the most productive things we could do, to slow down, to rest weekly, nightly, and throughout the day. And then finally, the seventh principle is eliminate all hurry. I borrowed this from my friend John Mark Comer's terrific book, The Ruthless Elimination of Hurry. Jesus was crazy busy during his time on earth. One time in the gospel biographies, his family comes and grabs him and says he's, quote, out of his mind. He's so busy. But he was never over busy to the extent that he was snapping at other people in his life, or he appeared to be internally frantic and anxious. That's the line between busyness and hurry. And Jesus always seemed to stay on the right side of that line. And if we want to redeem our time the way he did, we've got to do the same thing. So at a really, really high level, that's a rough sketch of those seven principles. And then, as you know, Tim, the rest of the book takes those seven principles and maps them to more than 30 hyper-practical practices that show, okay, what does that actually look like in the 21st century? Because the way Jesus did that in the first century is going to look really different than the way you and I integrate those principles today.
Yeah, and those are some very practical ideas and tools you share, because I think that's a big part of putting all of these principles into practice can be a real challenge for people. You know, you had run a program, Jordan, at least once, actually twice now, I think, that I was a part of, that you did some coaching with individuals that had read the book on a small community basis. As you ran, I think, at least two of those, maybe more now. I mean, what were some of the themes that you kind of picked up that people seem to struggle the most with?
The first one that comes to mind is just really based on chapter 2 in the book. So let me backtrack for a second.
Yeah.
I would argue that in order for our yes to be yes, we have to have a system to track all of our commitments. I call this a commitment tracking system.
CTS.
CTS. And a lot of people listening are like, oh yeah, I've set up something like this before. I've set up a to-do list app, whatever. Here's where it breaks down though. People believe that they can make a one-time investment of time to set up their systems and the system is going to maintain order on its own, right? That's just not how life works. Take my house, for example. If I go more than a day without cleaning up all my kids' toys, the house is going to be an absolute nightmare. And the same is true with whatever systems we are using to keep track of our to-dos, our projects and commitments. So where this typically breaks down for people is when they don't spend a little bit of time, I'm talking 15, 30 minutes a day, tending to that system, maintaining it, doing what I call a weekly review, what David Allen calls a weekly review in his great book, Getting Things Done. That's where things really start to break down and where people have problems. And here's the sad reality, right? I've read 50 time management books throughout my career. All of them treat time management as like an easy problem to solve. That's ludicrous. Like, you know how I know it's not easy? Because there's 60,000 time management books, right? But like, I think just having that mindset going into any effort to redeem our time is really critical. Knowing that this isn't going to be easy. We can make it easier, but it's never going to be perfectly simple. And signing up for that, knowing that hard things are the things worth doing. They're the things that make us purposeful, present, and wildly productive, as I say in the book.
So I'm kind of taking this broader than the individual. Yeah. I mean, your mission is to help Christians, respond to the biblical radical truth that work matters for eternity. And our audience of this podcast are business owners in a lot of cases, or people that are responsible for others. I mean, what advice do you have for entrepreneurs actively working on their cultures, Jordan, to ensure the work everyone doing does really matter?
Such a good question, Tim. And I'll just remind our listeners, right? We've been talking about my work as an author in this book, but I spent 10 years running some pretty serious tech startups. I know this challenge. We ran a venture called Threshold 360. I ran it as CEO for 2.5 years, and we grew 5 to 150 people in 2.5 years. That's pretty rapid.
Yeah, pretty fast.
And the thing that mattered the most was making sure everybody understood what mattered most and making sure that everybody's work and everybody's goals connected to the company's overall vision and goals. And real practically what that looked like for us at Threshold, it was really a threshold that I fell in love with the objectives and key results goal setting framework, OKRs for short. John Doerr made this famous. Google made this famous. I'm just a massive fan of this goal setting framework because unlike KPIs or any other sort of goal setting framework I've come across in the past, it does a really great job of making sure everyone within the organization, everybody's goals are deeply attached and connected to the company. So for example, one quarter at Threshold, we had a single objective, live to fight another day, essentially, right? We needed to raise more money, survive, right? Yeah. And we had one key result, get to X amount in revenue, right? That was it. Whole quarter, one key result. What that meant though was every single person on the team who had individual goals had to justify how their goals that they were executing against the quarter contributed and rolled up to that ultimate goal of increasing revenue. So if there was a product engineer that wanted to build some new feature, if they couldn't show and demonstrate how that was going to increase revenue, that project was on ice until we lived to fight another day, right? So it's just a really practical example of how we did that at Threshold, how I've done it throughout my career. I just love OKRs. They're really simple to implement and they make sure everybody is focused on what actually matters in moving the business forward.
You really focused on that as, again, simple maybe, but not easy. And kept that as a quarterly focus.
Yeah, but I'll add to that too. It's impossible for the organization to know what's important if you, the leader, don't know what's important. Yeah. And oftentimes the founders I run into, they're so consumed with new information constantly being tethered to their laptop, constantly being tethered to email, that they don't have the space to themselves discern the essential from the noise, right? So I think that's such a critical practice. In fact, one of our investors at Threshold pulled me aside one day and he's like, hey, we're trying to build a profile of the ideal CEO to invest, right? In your opinion, what's the number one thing we should be looking for? And that's the answer I gave. I said, the ability to discern the essential from the noise. When you're leading an organization that's growing quickly, that's changing quickly, everything looks important and almost nothing is, right? So the whole game is figuring out what really matters. And that's impossible to do, I would argue, without long periods of silence and solitude.
Descent from the kingdom of noise.
Yeah. That's it.
Yeah. Yeah. And to a certain extent, I think you may have answered this, Jordan, but as a leader, that is struggling to enroll their people in, whether it's that objective or cultural dynamic they're trying to lean into, just because of the humanity gets in the way. What tools do you advise them to lean into? Obviously, OKRs are definitely one of them.
Yeah. And specifically as it relates to getting the team really focused.
Yeah, focused.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. It's a real simple thing, but again, hard to do. Just communicating ad nauseum what matters most. I mean,
one of Amanda's favorite topics.
Is that Amanda's favorite topic? I love it. It's saying the same thing so many times that you can say it in your sleep and you get sick and tired of saying it every single time. That's when people are finally starting to hear what you're saying, right? So it's not enough to hole away for a weekend or a week to set OKRs once a quarter. You got to be preaching that North Star goal, those North Star key results constantly throughout the organization.
Yes. Just when you think they've heard it too many times, you may be getting close.
You may be getting close.
When they actually are saying, oh, that's what you meant. We've covered a fair amount of topics in a short period of time. And you, having run businesses yourself before you've done this, again, mentioned you were a Google fellow. I mean, what do you see as the biggest challenges business leaders are facing today?
Oh, man.
Maybe a long list.
Honestly, the first thing that comes to mind, maybe it's just because we're talking about, but I don't think so, is the ability to break away and think. Mr. Rogers once said, just make the time to think and it'll change everything in the world. Right? It's so simple, but I really think that's so true. I think another big challenge leaders are facing right now is really keeping up with change, right? I mean, entire industries are changing so rapidly right now. Where people work is changing really quickly. The cost benefit analysis of all that is so out of whack. So I think there's a lot, but I think the solution, right, is still largely the same. In rapidly changing environments, finding the time to, number one, think, be quiet so that you could solve the problem. But also, silence is not just the means to solutions, it's also the means to sanity, right? So many leaders I know right now are so tired and so burnt out, right? That even if they did have silence, they don't have enough creative energy to really solve the problems facing their organization, right? So we need silence to solve the problems, but we need it for our sanity. We also need lots of rest. I think when I look out 5-10 years from now, if I were to predict the leaders who are going to be the most successful, I'm not going to go as far as to say it's the leaders who rest the most. That doesn't make sense. But it is the leaders who have baked regular times of rest into their schedule. I'll give you a story that I think illustrates this from personally for the past year. Last summer, my wife and I took our kids to Rhode Island. And while we were there, I ran into a business mentor that I hadn't seen for about 5 years. And we were on vacation. It was a short vacation. It was like a week, whatever. And I spent about an hour talking to this guy. And afterwards, he shot me a text message. He said, hey, you seem so much more rested and so much less anxious than I've ever seen you before in your life. And he said, this is like, and it's not vacation rest. Because if anyone's ever traveled with kids, they know there's no rest.
Not a road trip to Vermont.
Yeah, exactly, right. And so he said, what's going on? What's the difference? And I told him that since the last time I saw him, I had begun observing this biblical idea called Sabbath, where for one day a week, I do absolutely nothing I have to do. And I only do things I get to do, like spending time with my church family, like enjoying the greatest food my city has to offer, playing with my kids and not touching my phone for 24 hours. And he, my mentor, responded back in a text message like, that's exactly what I expected. Because he has observed the Sabbath his entire life. And it's been a game changer for me. So I would encourage you, Christian or not, to consider this idea that Sabbath, this idea of one day off a week, truly off, not just off your computer, but mentally off, can actually be one of the most productive things for your sanity, but also one of the most productive things as you're chasing after your goals. Chick-fil-A is another case in point here, right? Chick-fil-A is one of the most productive retailers on the planet, right?
6 days a week.
6 days a week. It's crazy, but they're able to pull it off. And there's so many other stories like that. So I think the most successful leaders, the most impactful leaders, the ones with the greatest company cultures are going to be cultures that encourage that type of rest.
I think I guess I'll speak for myself, Jordan, as type A that's been pushing it for a few decades. And Amanda and I actually were just having this discussion last week, ironically enough, but it's counterintuitive, I guess. And this kind of gets to your work in the sense that the world tells us more, push harder, push harder. That's obviously not the kingdom of God's message. And you talk in your book about the idea of Sabbath, not just in the sense of a day, but, technology. I think that's another topic that just seems to be coming up. There's this whole conversation that time seems to be going by faster and faster. And it seems to be running parallel with the speed of computing.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Don't know that there's a correlation there, but maybe perhaps. What have been the effects? Because again, in reading your book, I made some changes in my relationship with technology, I'll say.
Yeah.
Not just from a rest perspective, but from a focus perspective. But,
it's not a coincidence that the rise in smartphones perfectly correlates to a massive drop in American productivity as a whole, right? Go look at the Bureau of Labor and Statistics. They got all this data. It's really fascinating. And a dramatic rise in our anxiety.
Yeah.
And there's lots been talk about, our devices making us more anxious. I think a little bit less on how our devices are making us so unproductive. But yeah, for me, I'm sure a lot of our listeners have read or heard of Cal Newport's terrific work, Deep Work, this great book talking about how to do really focused, intense work at the office. I would argue that we don't just want deep work, we want deep lives. We want deep relationships with our kids and with our spouses. And so for me, that looks like two things. When I'm at work, my phone is on do not disturb 100% of the time, 100% of the time. And I only check emails at predetermined times every day. Even when I was running Threshold day-to-day as CEO, as a very sales-focused CEO, I was only checking my email 3 times a day. I did not let email tell me when to check my messages. I decide when I check my messages, period. I think that's how we grew from 5 to 150 people in 2 years. I think that's a huge part of it, right?
I believe it.
But then conversely, at home, I was really convicted of this when I was running that business. I would be super focused at the office, and then I'd come home and I would mindlessly check Instagram while I'm trying to play with my kids. I was so deeply convicted of this one day. And so I started a really simple practice that has changed my life and changed the lives of a lot of readers of this book. I parent my phone. When I'm done with the workday, I take my phone, I put it in my master bathroom, I put it on silent, and I don't touch it again until my kids go to bed. So from 5 to 7:30, it just sits there, right? And then when my kids go to bed, I pick it up, I check text messages, I don't check emails, right? I spend 5-10 minutes responding to texts. And then I put my phone to bed at least an hour before I go to bed. I don't mean literally next to my bed. It's in the other room. It's in my master bathroom.
Outside your room.
But that practice has been a total game changer for me to be able to do the deep work of loving my children and my spouse as myself. I mean, it's been one of the most life-giving things. And it's a simple thing. And I know some people are listening back. I can't do that. My team needs me from those hours. So here's how you could tweak this practice. Still put your phone in your master bathroom, but keep the ringer on, right? And if somebody really needs you, right, and you're not responding to your emails or not responding to your texts, if they really need you urgently, they'll call your cell phone. They'll call your cell phone, right? If they're really desperate. But here's the thing. Nothing's really that urgent.
Yeah, I was going to say.
Nothing's urgent. Nothing's
been running businesses for almost 30 years, and I convinced myself over the years that things were, but for a 2.5-hour time block, the world will not come to an end.
The world's not going to end.
Nor will your business.
That's right.
In most instances I can think of. You are obviously very well read. You mentioned mentors. I am curious for our listeners, Jordan, in addition to the Bible, so I'm going to say that that's probably the foundational answer of this question, but in addition to the Bible, what have been the most influential resources you've turned to as an entrepreneur for your own professional personal development?
So the book that really changed my perspective on work and the meaning of work, right? What is the purpose of this whole thing? A book called Every Good Endeavor by Timothy Keller. Really smart, highly intellectual pastor out of New York. It's a great book written from a Christian perspective. And a couple more that have been radical for me. Getting Things Done by David Allen was a total game changer. Now, I actually don't recommend the book anymore because I think I summarized it in a lot less time in chapter 2 of Redeeming Your Time. I told David that. But that book radically changed my life. The people in my life trust that when Jordan Raynor says he's going to do something, Jordan Raynor is going to do it 99 out of 100 times. I'm not perfect. Nobody's perfect. No. But 99 out of 100 times, I'm doing what I'm saying I'm going to do. That's a pretty valuable thing. And I owe all that to David Allen and Getting Things Done. A tearfully boring book, but a massive,
it's a tough one to get through.
It's a tough one to get through. Just read chapter 2 of Redeeming Your Time. And the last one I would say, which is newer, is really shaped my thinking just in the last 3 years about talent management and hiring. I recommend it nonstop. It's called No Rules Rules by Reed Hastings, the CEO of Netflix. It's an extraordinary book. I mean, I feel like most business books are saying pretty much the exact same thing that every book that came before them is saying.
Yeah.
Reed's saying some crazy stuff, i.e., encourage your team to take calls from recruiters and report back how much money they're being offered so that we can match it, right? Crazy stuff. But I think the way they think about talent density and why it's the thing to hire A players and only A players from the very start of a venture, I just think they're spot on in a lot of regards. I don't agree with everything, but I agree with a lot.
Okay. Those are good. I read a lot. I'm familiar with Tim Keller, but I have not read a book, so I'll add that to the list. I just made a note. You have mentioned mentors. I'm curious as to how you see that playing into your professional, personal success and what advice you might give entrepreneurs. That's a question that seems to be coming up more and more.
Yeah, it's a really good one. I talk a little bit about this. That's not true. I talk a lot about this in a book I wrote a couple years ago called Master of One.
Yes.
Right? The difference between what I call direct and indirect apprenticeships, right? Mentors, right? An indirect apprenticeship is when an entrepreneur reads books like Walter Isaacson's biography of Steve Jobs or like 0 to 1 by Peter Thiel or No Rules Rules and learns from those entrepreneurs from afar. There's no personal relationship, right? There's just reading, absorbing information, reading Fast Company, reading Entrepreneur Magazine, whatever it is, reading The Hustle and learning indirectly. And that's really valuable. I've learned a lot as an entrepreneur through the years, through those indirect relationships. But I have learned exponentially more and more importantly, exponentially faster via direct apprenticeships, where there is, for example, when I was running Threshold as CEO, I reported to a board for the first time. And that was such a monumentally valuable experience because I wasn't just reading from them. I was coming to them with my specific challenges and they were coaching me through those things based on my specific strengths and my specific weaknesses, right? That, in my opinion, is far more valuable than indirect apprenticeships. Both are great. But if you can get in a position where you can find a direct mentor that is asking you very personal questions, getting all up in your business and giving you really critical feedback to make you a stronger leader, I would always opt for that.
Yeah, I think that's really good counsel because I know it's great to be well-read, listen to podcasts like this one and yours, and the direct relationship and the ability to unpack the reality of what you're experiencing. And to your point, I think that's also spot on is we all have our strengths, we all have our weaknesses, and building a team around us that helps augment the weaknesses to our strengths that makes us successful. So any final thoughts, Jordan, as we wrap up today for entrepreneurs out there? Obviously, read the book. We will put a link to the book on our show notes, Redeeming Your Time. I've now read all of your books, including your most recent one, and we are still giving those out. Purchased 1,000 of those books to give out in the community, and it's really been impactful to the organizations that we've been at. Amanda's been an instrumental help in that. But
that's awesome.
Yeah.
I'll leave you with this. Knowing who we're talking to, entrepreneurs and leaders, I'm going to leave them with the final words of this picture book I wrote, The Creator in You. So I would argue that God was the first entrepreneur. When you look at Genesis 1:1 in the Holy Scriptures, before the God of the universe told us that he is holy or loving or omnipotent or omnipresent, as we were talking about before, he tells us that he's a God who makes things, right? He's a God who creates for the good of others. And that's what entrepreneurs do. And then he doesn't just create on his own. This is what the whole picture book is about. He creates us to create with him. Right? The sixth day of the quote unquote day of the Genesis 1 account isn't the end of creation, it's the beginning. And so I close the book by saying this, and this is a charge for our listeners. There's a charge to the reader. It says, create new businesses and movies, medicine and hope, make laws or computers or a new telescope. Because when you work or you make something new, you are doing what God has made you to do. You're showing the world what your Father is like, a God who creates to bring people delight. And when you show others the Creator in you, you bring joy to the world and to your Father too. So what's the message? The message is, as entrepreneurs, we're not just out there building products to serve our needs. We're not just doing this for fame and fortune. We're doing it to serve others, to love our neighbors as ourselves. And when we do, I believe when we do it in ways that honor God's word, honor the manual of the Creator of the universe, we bring him pleasure as well.
There's nothing more to say after that, Jordan. I want to say thank you very much for joining us today on Winning Through Culture. It's been a wonderful episode. Just really appreciate your time, appreciate the work you've done, the impact you've had in my life and the lives of those around me. Again, another episode here, Winning Through Culture. Until we're together again, please be impactful and relevant. And again, please read Redeeming Your Time. It will make a big difference in your life. Thank you, Jordan.
Thank you, Tim.